In the last video, we saw how to very easily change the stroke and fill colors using this color palette at the bottom of the screen here. But if I zoom right into this particular object, you can see a couple of problems. Number one, this stroke is so small that at 100% you can barely even see it. And number two, I really don't like the way these corners are being kind of lopped off like this. So we're going to see now how you can use the stroke and fill panel to affect your stroke of an object with tons and tons of control. And the easiest way to get access to that panel is to go to this bottom left hand corner, and where you see fill and stroke, you can just click either one of these colored bars. And here we have the fill and stroke panel. There are three tabs: fill, stroke paint, and stroke style. These first two deal with colors, and this deals with the style of your strokes, and that's what we focused on in this video. So the first thing you can do is change the width of your stroke. Right now this stroke is really tiny, it's only 0.2 of a pixel. So if I change that to 3 pixels, you see that we now get a much thicker stroke. You might not want something that quite that thick, but this is good just to demonstrate what you can do here. The second option is how you want your corners to be joined. So if we zoom right in, as we saw, we've got this problem where our corners are being kind of locked off and it just doesn't look very good. Now, join is the option you want if you want to get a nice sharp corner, but our problem at the moment is that this meter limit is set to only 4. The meter limit tells Inkscape how far out from the corner of this path it's allowed to keep drawing in order to make a nice sharp corner. So if I increase this to something like 10, it's allowed to go much further, and so you see we get this nice sharp corner. If, however, you see this corner, it's still getting lopped off. The reason is that from the actual corner of these two paths, 10 is still not enough. So if we were to increase this to something like 20, and just zoom out, there you can see that we actually finally get this cornered point. And at the end of the day, what we can see is that this effect doesn't actually work very well for this object. This corner looks kind of silly. So if we zoom back in, we can change this from join to rounded. And what rounded does is it just takes all your corners, and instead of having a flat, sharp cutoff edge, you get this nice rounded effect, which I think works very well for this object. The last option you have is simply bevel, and that's just going to lop the edges off. Bevel is exactly the same as setting it to join with a meter limit of 0. So in that case, you're going to get the same effect. I'm going to leave that set to rounded. Cap deals with open paths. So this object right here is a closed path. All these little corner points are closed corners, and everything joins up with itself. These violin strings, on the other hand, are open paths. So if I select this string and zoom right in on this corner, we have some options as to how this endpoint should look. Butt cap is just going to lop things off. Square cap is also going to lop things off, but it's just a little bit longer. The best option in most cases is going to be a round cap, and here we see we get a much nicer rounded effect. Then another option you have is how you want the actual stroke to look. So at the moment, dashes is just set to this solid line. You could set it to something like these dots. And you can determine how close you want them to be, and then you get this kind of effect. And this numerical option is just going to determine how far along it starts. But I'm going to leave that set to solid because this is after all a violin string. And one other option you have, which is quite cool, is the start, mid, and end markers. And if you click these down pointing arrows, it gives you a whole lot of options that you can attach to either the start, the end, or the middle of a path. Mid markers will just repeat. And then start and end, you only get one on the start or the end. So if, for example, I go to end markers, you get these options where we have, for example, .l, .m, and .s. If I was to set .s, what you see is that we get this nice black dot at the end of this path. And considering that this is a violin, I think that works really, really well because it makes it look like there's some kind of little dot that's joining up the end of this string to the violin. I might want something a little bit bigger, so maybe I'll try .m for .medium, and that's a little bit better, so we can actually see it. Now, you can't actually change the color of this dot in Inkscape. It just comes out as black, and these set shapes are the only ones that you can use. However, that's not such a huge problem if I wanted this to be a different color, because I could of course take this into GIMP and then just use something like the paint bucket to fill this in with any color that I want. You can then lastly change the blur and opacity, but this actually deals with an entire object. So I'm going to move up and across and just zoom out a little bit. If we select this character object, if we increase the blur, you'll see that it just gets completely blurred out. But you can get some nice subtle effects, which can work really well in some cases. For example, if you have a character against a background, it looks a lot more realistic if the background is kind of blurred out. And then opacity is just going to determine how see-through this entire object is. So if I set this all the way down to 0, you won't see it at all. Low opacity, you can just see it, and then obviously it gets more and more opaque. So those are your options for manipulating the stroke of an object. That's the stroke style. It's extremely useful and it can make your life very, very easy.